This is the David Doel Show on In-Depth Radio, News Talk 1010.
Welcome to the David Doel Show, your rational look at news, politics, and culture, right here on In-Depth Radio, News Talk 1010. I, of course, am your host, David Doel, and coming up on today's show, a conservative MP has threatened legal action against Twitter users for calling him racist. I'll break down those details and take your calls on that after 9:15. Also, the results of the American midterm elections and why a battle going on in Georgia should bother anyone concerned about the future of democracy. And later on in the show, how can we address PTSD? Some incredible research shows that we do have a potential solution, but can we convince society to adopt it? I'll explain that. All that and more coming up on the David Doel Show. But first, it's Remembrance Day in Canada. And on Remembrance Day, instead of filling it with endless platitudes and empty gestures, I think we should focus on what more we can do for our veterans. Housing First programs for homeless veterans is a step in the right direction. And of course, later on in the show, I'll be discussing a potential solution for PTSD, which of course many veterans suffer from. But also, as my next guest writes, quote, "We need to remember not just the sacrifices of soldiers, but also the extraordinary resolve our society showed the last time it faced an existential threat." Those words from Robert Green, teacher at Westmount High School in Montreal and a contributor to Ricochet.media and the writer of the opinion piece titled "Shared Sacrifices of the Past Show Way Forward on Climate." Robert, welcome to the show.
How you doing?
Doing great. So your piece really stood out to me. You make a connection that I don't often see, and that's connecting World War to climate change. So explain how you see that connection and why we should be taking climate change as seriously as a new world war.
Well, I have to say I can't take credit for sort of making that connection myself. I mean, I first heard David Suzuki making that connection recently. And before that, you know, people like Noam Chomsky have also been making that connection in their public statements. And, you know, I think it's an important connection to make because we've just had this report from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change that is really it's an alarming statement and a call for humanity to act. And the consequences of not acting are cataclysmic on a level that makes, you know, the threat posed by Nazism seem small. And, you know, that's an almost unthinkable thing to say when you consider what that threat represented in our world.
Mm-hmm.
So, you know, what the IPCC has said is that we have 12 years to reduce global emissions by 45%, and until 2050 to reduce them further by 100%. So this is the kind of action, or this is the kind of a target that is not going to require small actions. This is we need to fundamentally change the way that we're doing things. And I think the kind of actions that we took, you know, during the Second World War, we need to look back on and be inspired by.
Mm-hmm. So how do you think Canada fares so far in terms of their action on climate change? Clearly, I think I can assume you don't think we're going far enough. But what do you think Canada and the world really has done to try and combat this, and what more should we do?
Well, we've set some targets, but we really haven't done enough at all to make the fundamental changes in our economy. So, I mean, just to give you a couple of examples, I mean, just, you know, we in Canada subsidize the fossil fuel industry to the tune of about $3.3 billion a year. Mm-hmm. You know, imagine what that amount of money could do in terms of subsidies for green industry that would be creating jobs and not threatening the planet. You know, just for example, I mean, the geothermal potential here in Canada is enormous, and you know. Iceland, back in the 70s, made major investments to shift over its public buildings over to geothermal, and has been reaping the rewards since, both for the environment and for their economy. So we have to look at doing those sorts of things. And so, but in addition to the $3.3 billion in subsidies we've got, our prime minister has just bought a pipeline for $4.5 billion, right?
That pipeline is ridiculous.
A pipeline that no oil company would invest in because it was so risky economically. And so, this is something that's as potentially as disastrous for Canada's economy as it is cataclysmic for the world. So, we in Canada, we have a disproportionate effect in terms of our carbon footprint, and that means I think we have a responsibility to be world leaders, in this struggle.
Yeah, and Canada were world leaders on this issue in the 80s, and it seems like we kind of fell off since then.
Well, absolutely, and if you look at the action that was initiated by Canada to take care of the ozone layer, I mean that has yielded success. I mean, they're saying like the ozone layer is now fixed. So collective action works, but what is missing is the political will, and that's what's needed. And I think also we need to look at the sorts of things our governments did during the Second World War to ensure victory. And that was to intervene in the economy. Like, we didn't sort of mess around with worrying about whether or not certain actions would, offend the tenets of free market ideology.
Yeah, that was actually my next question. So
right.
In the piece, you talk about the strong government intervention during the World War and how the Crown Corporations and Bank of Canada, what they were doing during wartime. Can you sort of go into that and give people this perspective of how big of a deal that was in terms of what they were doing at that time?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, you have to consider that, at this point in Canada's history, we were just, coming out of the Great Depression, and suddenly we had these enormous needs for war production. And so the question was sort of how to fund that. And, our government, to its credit, I think, came up with a very good idea and, founded a public bank. And, the purpose of the Bank of Canada, as written right into its own charter, was to give loans to the different levels of government, to, I think, first the federal and provincial, and I think later even municipal governments were getting in on it. And they got interest-free loans that would be paid back, but that, for that time could be used to ramp up war production, to create these crown corporations that were doing everything from, building new homes for the industrial workforce to actually producing, weapons and vehicles and clothing and equipment and all the things that were needed for war. Mm-hmm. And so, and the remarkable thing about this was, by simultaneously also regulating the private creation of money by, tightening the rules on the banks, this didn't cause any inflation to happen. Like that's always the big worry that people always raise when you talk about, government basically printing money and spending it into existence. Mm-hmm. I mean, this is a little bit different than that in that it's loaning money to itself. So eventually that money comes back out of the supply. But for a time it's in there. But, to accomplish that without inflation, you just tighten up the private creation of money being done by the banks. So, and so this not only allowed us to achieve a remarkable level of production throughout the entire war, but it also fueled the post-war boom. We built all of Canada's infrastructure in that area, and this was basically the period where Canada's middle class emerged. And it was largely because the government was busy doing things like building memorial hockey arenas, and all the hospitals and schools that are in Canada were largely built in this post-war era. And it was all being accomplished with interest-free loans from the Bank of Canada. And so, and it's something that we stopped doing, sadly, in the 1970s. Pierre Trudeau signed an international agreement saying that we would not use the Bank of Canada in this way anymore. And since then, what's happened? We've had skyrocketing debts. We have crumbling infrastructure. And we see we have a whole lot of needs. Public programs are being hit with austerity. So, what I think is needed right now is basically a big push and an infusion of government money on the level that we did in the lead up to the Second World War and after, to rapidly transform our economy into one that is not threatening our collective survival.
Mm-hmm. So we're talking with Robert Greene, writer of Shared Sacrifices of the Past, Show Way Forward on Climate, which you can read on Ricochet.media. So in your piece, you also say, and this is sort of an extension of what you were saying, you say, quote, part of the reason remembering is so important to many is that it reminds us of what we are capable of achieving through our collective sacrifices. Yeah. So in terms of our collective sacrifices, is this, do you mean this in terms of what the government has to sort of invest, or also the sacrifice of the citizens of Canada?
Both. I mean, and that's, again, what was so remarkable about the war effort is that we were sort of demanding that our political leadership do whatever it takes for victory. And simultaneously, Canadians were also getting involved in all kinds of ways, from purchasing war bonds to doing things like, saving scrap metal, and even things like bacon grease were getting recycled for the war effort. So that is kind of what we need right now. I think too much of the emphasis on sort of how to improve our environmental situation has been put solely on sort of individual consumer actions. And these are important. I don't want to say that's not important, but I think much more important is the sort of collective actions that we take, and the action of, sort of first and foremost, demanding that our government make this a priority, because, as the IPCC has said, time is running out. And we're already seeing the consequences of this. Like, my God, in the news today, hearing the voices of people out of Paradise, California, who have their entire community just burnt to the ground. And it's what we've been seeing in BC. I mean, in the last 2 years, over 1 million hectares of forest have burned, 2 seasons in a row. So, we're already living the consequences, and those are just going to increase. And so it's not something that we can be messing around with. I mean, I think Trudeau's move for a carbon tax is a step forward, but it's not enough.
Yeah,
we need to be doing sort of much more than that. Again, like, a 45% reduction in 12 years is a pretty tall order.
So I always struggle with how to exactly communicate how important the climate crisis is and our need to address it. How do you think the media should improve their approach to covering climate change and make it as urgent as an issue as, say, pointing out when Hitler was the enemy?
Well, I think part of it has to be in doing a better job of connecting the dots. I mean, I think too often a lot of the events that are reported are sort of reported as, tragic incidences without sort of always, first and foremost, making the connection that these things that are happening are a product of climate change, and that this is going to be happening more and more. And I think doing much more to give voice to the courageous scientists that are ringing the alarm bells about this. I mean, some of the things I've been reading is that they're in a state of personal crisis with, observing the data that they're seeing, because it's it's unimaginable what the implications are. And I think we all have an obligation to look at that data ourselves, and the media has a role to put that in our face, because that's what's going to hopefully cajole us into acting and making us demand of our political leaders to make this the only priority if necessary, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So I completely agree. I've seen a lot of coverage on these forest fires in California, and a lot of images of fire and burning houses and burned out cars, but very little connecting it to actual the issue of climate change and showing that this is happening because of climate change, and we need to address this as a serious issue. Otherwise, this will continue to be a problem. We're gonna. I mean, the droughts. I mean, there's endless. Really, the hurricanes. It's really endless in terms of what this has, how this has impacted us, and the media needs to do a better job at connecting all of these issues. So,
exactly.
Do you think there's anything people at home could do to try and push their government and maybe the media and society in general to take climate change more seriously?
Well, I think the upcoming federal election is going to be a chance for people to make this an issue. I think we need to reject, all of the parties that are talking about a status quo where oil companies continue to be subsidized with billions of dollars of our tax money that could be used to create the kind of sustainable economy that hopefully will be there for future generations.
Yeah, and I saw you at the end of your piece. You discussed briefly the protests that were happening around Quebec as well. So I think that's also an important point to push on to make sure people actually get out there in the streets.
Exactly, and it was an enormous turnout. We had tens of thousands of people out in the streets here in Montreal, and then other demos happening in cities throughout Quebec. And I think that also has to be part of it. Like, this needs to be a social movement that is both acting in the electoral sphere, but also even considering things like civil disobedience to put pressure on to force changes in our society.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Robert Greene is a Montreal teacher, blogger at Montreal Teachers for Change, and is the writer of the opinion piece titled "Shared Sacrifices of the Past Show Way Forward on Climate" on Ricochet.media. Robert, thanks again for joining me.
My pleasure.
Coming up next, a Conservative MP has threatened legal action against at least 4 Twitter users for calling him racist. And I want to get your thoughts on this. 416-872-1010. You can also text me at 71010. Once again, that number is 416-872-1010, or text me at 71010. This is The David Doel Show on In-Depth Radio, News Talk 1010.
The David Doel Show continues on News Talk 1010.
Welcome back to The David Doel Show, your rational look at news, politics, and culture, right here on In-Depth Radio, News Talk 1010. Now, before I get to this segment that I want to discuss here, I got some nice text messages, which is a nice change. It's always good to see some positivity out there. Somebody in Newmarket stayed up to listen to the show, so thank you there. And also some great comments about the climate change interview that I just had in the first segment, so thank you very much. But we have to get to something very important now. There is a snowflake alert. And no, I'm not talking about the weather, which, of course, we're going to unfortunately be seeing some snow in the future. I'm talking about Conservative MP Carrie Diot, who has threatened legal action against at least 4 people on Twitter that called him racist. He's claiming libel and slander. Now, I come from the world of YouTube, where if you know anything about YouTube comments, then you know that they are largely terrible. Though I have to say I have a good audience, so there's also a lot of positivity on my comments as well. But just an example, I was going through some of the comments today, and somebody called me a quote-unquote cancerous whore. Now, as far as I know, I am not a cancerous whore. So when I read that comment, I laughed out loud. I did not run to the phone and call my lawyer and think about suing this person. I'm going to go more into this story, but I want to get your thoughts on this. So I'm taking your calls at 416-872-1010, and you can also text at 71010. Now, this Conservative MP, so he's threatening legal action after he was called racist on Twitter by some Twitter users. Now, I think this seems to be it appears to be an attack on our fundamental freedom of expression. Now, one of the accused is Edmonton writer Bashir Mohammed, who received a letter from Conservative MP Kerry Diott's lawyer demanding that he remove a series of tweets. He wrote that Kerry Diott is racist on Twitter, pointing to the MP's picture with a well-known white nationalist. Now, Mohammed's lawyer defends his claim, saying in part that Diott is a public figure who has posed with a well-known white nationalist and racist, and he himself posted the photos to social media. And Diott has praised the work of that white nationalist and also has a history of liking tweets made by well-known racist Twitter accounts. And he has also failed to denounce any of these actions even after being called on to do so. So if you yourself post pictures online with a well-known white nationalist, and yes, I'm not saying this person's name on purpose, I feel like we don't really need to elevate these people that already have that are already elevated. But I mean, you could look it up if you really want to know who this white nationalist is. But they are a well-known white nationalist, and this Conservative MP himself posted these images online as, I guess, I don't know, sort of a support or saying that he likes this person. But legally, there doesn't appear to be any real defense here. So the defense that the people can make that are being potentially sued over this is the defense of fair comment. So fair comment protects any opinion fairly made on a matter of public interest. This can involve political commentary or the critical review of books, movies, or even restaurants. So I think it's clear that this is simply fair comment. I mean, if you're in the public eye, you are seen taking a picture with a well-known white nationalist. You have a history of liking tweets that are pro-white nationalism or racist ideas. I think there's a pretty good argument there that you are likely racist. And I'm not sure how this Conservative MP, Kerry Diott, would be able to prove otherwise. I mean, this is the sort of argument where if you're being called racist, at this point, just take it. Don't create this whole story out of it, because now it's become a news item, and now more people are aware that you took images or took pictures with a well-known white nationalist and that you have liked white nationalist tweets in the past. Now, again, I'm taking your calls on this, 416-872-1010, or text me at 71010. Now, this white nationalist, who, as I said, will remain nameless unless any caller brings the name up, has, let me give you some examples here. So this is some direct quotes from this white nationalist. Quote, "No one is going to save the white man except for himself." Here's another one. "We must secure the existence of our people and a future for white children." End quote. Now, what else does that mean? Obviously, this white nationalist is for white nationalism. They are for securing the future of their white children. Here's another one. This is from this white nationalist that a Conservative MP, Kerry Diott, took a picture with. So this white nationalist said in relation to letting immigrants in, quote, "Solutions are going to become more and more drastic if we keep letting in these immigrants." Clearly intimating, I think, a race war. Now, I don't quite understand how somebody can take a picture with somebody who has said these sorts of things and not think, hey, maybe this will look bad. Maybe I shouldn't do this. But all Conservative MP Kerry Diott had to do was denounce it. Say, oh, it was a mistake. I should not have taken pictures with this white nationalist. Clearly, I don't agree with these ideas. And sure, I may have been called racist, but I'm just going to let that slide because people call people names on Twitter and online in general all the time. It's not a big deal. Me as somebody, again, I have a YouTube channel. I'm on Twitter. Every day I get called something. I've been called racist. Right now. right now somebody sent a message in and they called me racist. So this happens constantly, and I laugh it off. You know why? Because I know I am not the things that I am being called. People only get touchy about these issues if they realize that, hey, maybe people will think it's true because there's actually some merit to it. There is some actual verifiable fact, like somebody I took a picture with who's a white nationalist. So I really don't understand this. And Edmonton writer Bashir Mohammed, in response to the letter that he received from Carrie Diott's lawyer, said, quote, "If this was years ago, if I was still in university when this happened, I would have deleted the tweet. But now I realize that I should stand up for my free expression and things that I truly believe in, which is that a politician should be accountable to people he endorses and the people he takes photos with." So I think it's pretty clear that Carrie Diott should not have taken this picture. But we have a call from Robert from Toronto. Robert, what are your thoughts on this?
I don't know who the particular guy you're talking about is that you're classifying as a white nationalist, but I don't think anything that you've read is white nationalism from my perspective. I think of,
so you think it's
nationalists as being people that hate minority groups and want to obliterate minority groups.
What do you think securing a future for white children, what do you think that means?
I think that means that when white children grow up and become adults looking for jobs, that they aren't going to find jobs if we continue to promote all of the other groups in front of white people.
Do you know how ridiculous that sounds? White people right now run the country.
They're not getting.
I'm white, by the way.
Well, that's good. That's great. But I'll tell you, if you try and go for a job in any public sector, in any university, as a white person, particularly as a white man, you get put at the back of the line. You're not at the front of the line for sure.
Maybe it's because white men are in every other position, like this radio show right now. I'm white. I got this radio show.
You may be right, but it doesn't make things better for people looking for jobs.
I have another question for you, though. Okay, so another comment that this white nationalist said, if we keep letting immigrants in, solutions are going to become more and more drastic. What do you think that means?
I have no idea. I really don't. I know what you're pointing to. You think that he's suggesting that we all have to shoot immigrants when they come across the border because that's a drastic move. But he's not saying that, and I don't know what he's saying.
But isn't that the whole point, though? That's how these people ride the line. That's how they're able to get the exposure that they get, because they don't outright say, hey, I want to kill people that don't look like me. What they do is they ride the line. But people that are other white nationalists, they know, they hear that dog whistle. They know exactly what that person means.
I actually hear people say, I want to kill these minority people. In fact, I hear women say, we got to kill all men. And the Washington Post publishes those things.
But these are not people that have any sort of platform or any way serious about it. The white nationalist I'm talking about has a history, a deep-rooted history in espousing these ideas, these white nationalist ideas. So I mean, how about let's say clearly we aren't going to agree on that. But apart from that, what do you think that a conservative MP or anybody, any politician, should be suing somebody over being called racist or being called any name on Twitter? Do you think that's okay?
I think at some point somebody has to step in and say, you can't divide the country like that by putting people into groups and saying our group is good and everybody else is bad.
But that wasn't the question. The question is, should we be able to sue somebody for calling us a name online?
Yeah, I actually do, because I think 100% I do. I thought your question was about whether a politician should be able to do that, but I think everybody should be able to do that. A politician may be more game for being called names that none of us want to be called, but these kind of divisive, tribalistic, divisive.
But if somebody is racist, isn't it okay to call them racist?
Yeah, 100%.
Okay, what is racist? What do you think racist is in your mind?
Racist means, for me, first of all, it's a negative description. It's harmful. There are lots of things that divide people by race that I wouldn't call racist in the sociological sense, but in the dictionary definition sense, they are racist. So, for example, if you're a doctor and you don't look at people's race, I think that's malpractice. There are certain diseases that only follow races, and certain races have those diseases. And if you don't take race into account, you're being a bad physician. But in terms of
not wanting to have immigrants come in, that's not racist to you?
It could be. It could very well be. I mean, there are other reasons to not have immigrants come in. Race is one of them. If you don't want people from Jamaica coming in, that's racist.
Okay.
If you don't want people
we agree.
who are so if you don't want people who are drug dealers and rapists and murderers coming in, I don't think that's racist.
Yeah, but that isn't based on race, though. I mean, you understand that. Like, I mean, we can go into it. You understand that, for example, in America, the majority of the crime is committed by people that were born in America. And in fact, immigrants commit by per capita less crime than people born in the country.
What I was responding to, though, is that I thought you were linking up racism with the quote that you read, which didn't say anything about race. It just said immigrants. And I gave you an example where having those kind of immigrants come in would not be a good thing. I wasn't talking about race either.
What do you mean, those kind of immigrants?
People that are drug dealers, rapists, and murderers.
But that's
not a race.
Yeah, but those are criminals. That's not like that. That's not a race.
That's right. So he wasn't talking about race. I mean, the quote that you gave didn't say anything about race. It talked about immigrants.
No, this conservative MP took pictures with a white nationalist, with a well-known white nationalist, and this white nationalist who doesn't want immigration because they want to secure a future for their white children. I mean, if that's not racist, I don't know what is.
I don't see it as racist. But there's nothing about race in there except his group.
Okay, well, I think we're going in circles, Robert. Thank you for the call, though. That was a very lively discussion there. So again, look, if you're just joining us, I'm talking about Conservative MP Kerry Diott, who has threatened legal action against at least 4 people on Twitter that called him racist. Now, he's claiming libel and slander. I don't think this falls under libel or slander, as it falls under fair comment, which protects any opinion fairly made on a matter of public interest. This can involve political commentary. But that's enough on that. Coming up next, the results of the American midterm elections and why a battle going on in Georgia should bother anyone concerned about the future of democracy. This is the David Doel Show on In-Depth Radio, News Talk 1010.
You're listening to the David Doel Show, News Talk 1010.
Welcome back to the David Doel Show, your rational look at news, politics, and culture, right here on In-Depth Radio, News Talk 1010. Now, before I get to this next segment here, I'm still recovering from that last call. So if you didn't hear it, it was a discussion between me and somebody that doesn't believe a white nationalist that I described comments from is a racist. Some of their comments, this white nationalist comment, not the caller, but the white nationalist I was referring to, some of their comments included how we should deal with immigrants now because it may get worse in the future. And I could just go into that whole conversation again. I'm afraid I might. Somebody sent in a message saying, "How are you not beating your head on the wall right now?" Yeah, I was close to, but I'll definitely be posting that discussion online. Follow me on Twitter at David Doel, last name spelled Doel. And at some point tomorrow you'll see a tweet about me posting a link to that discussion because I mean, it was lively. I'll say that. But more importantly, the midterm elections happened in the States this past week. Now, I follow American politics fairly closely. If you go to my YouTube channel at therationalnational.com, you'll see that. So, was there a blue wave for the Democratic Party as expected? Well, kind of. So, the Democratic Party did win back the House, which was fantastic. So it means there potentially can be now more investigations into Trump, including potentially seeing his tax returns. And also, of course, by winning back the House, they can stop harmful legislation from passing. But there were also disappointing losses, like in Texas, Beto O'Rourke lost his Senate race against Ted Cruz. Ted Cruz, who I do not understand how anybody votes for that guy. He is just oozes phoniness, oozes pure politician sleaze, takes all the money he can from large corporations, big donors, and then tells the voters he actually fights for them when he doesn't. But regardless, Beto O'Rourke, I mean, for a state that's supposed to be deep red, he came within 2 points. So at some point in the future, Texas is flipping. But of course, Florida, there was the loss, though there is now recounts in Florida for the Gillum race for governor and the Bill Nelson race for Senate as well. But Georgia, I have to touch on Georgia here because so Stacey Abrams went up against Secretary of State of Georgia, Brian Kemp, for governor of Georgia. Now, Stacey Abrams initially lost, but the votes are still being counted in an election where there were nearly 4 million ballots cast. Now, let me get into some numbers here, so pay close attention. As of today, the unofficial election results show Kemp leading by 1.5% with 58,000 more votes, a gap Abrams has closed from 75,000 votes since election night. But in the 3 months leading up to Election Day, more than 85,000 voters were purged from rolls under Brian Kemp. So Brian Kemp, who Stacey Abrams was up against in the race, he controlled the entire voting system. And people were purged from the rolls. So, there's even more of this. During 2017, 668,000 voters were purged. Of those 2017 numbers, 200,000 people left the state, died, or moved outside their district, making them legitimate cancellations. So 200,000 of that 668 purge were legitimate cancellations. But of the 400,000 who supposedly moved, 340,000 never moved and were wrongly purged. Also from 2012 to 2016, 1.5 million voters were purged. More than 10% of all voters in Georgia. So for comparison, 750,000 were purged from 2008 to 2012. So this is not even to mention all the issues on Election Day. So one county in Georgia had a single working voting machine at their poll because they weren't provided with the power supplies for the others. Now, Georgia is also one of only 5 states that doesn't provide paper ballot backups. No paper trail. And of course, the voter purges that I was referring to earlier happened in largely African American communities. This election was stolen from Stacey Abrams. Now, in the next segment, I'm going to get a little more into the other races that show potentially brighter future for the Democratic Party as actually being a party for the people. So coming up next, in addition to that, is there a magical solution for PTSD? I'll discuss some incredible research in the field of psychedelic medicine. This is the David Doel Show on In-Depth Radio, News Talk 1010.
Welcome back to the David Doel Show on News Talk 1010.
Welcome back to the David Doel Show, your rational look at news, politics, and culture, right here on In-Depth Radio, News Talk 1010. Now, post-traumatic stress disorder, also known as PTSD, is a huge problem facing veterans and others that have experienced traumatic events. But there's continued research into psychedelics potentially being used as a medicine to treat PTSD. So researchers spent 5 years dosing 26 combat veterans and first responders with varying levels of MDMA in a clinical setting. On average, before the study, participants had extreme PTSD symptoms, given a mean ranking of 87.1, with anything above 50 being severe. They were given varying doses and treated to an 8-hour guided trip with a professional therapist. And after this experience on MDMA, their PTSD rating fell from 87.1 to 38.8. Now, obviously, there's more to it than just the medicine itself. Beforehand, the patients are walked through how PTSD affects the brain, and are set realistic goals for each individual, sort of to gauge the experience and better understand potentially how the MDMA may help them. And the whole 8-hour experience, which is one of 3 separate experiences, includes a safe room with fresh flowers, light music, and a therapist on call to guide them through it. There's, of course, also follow-up visits from therapists, phone calls, and continuing therapy. Now, this study was so successful that MAPS, which is the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies, is pushing to designate MDMA treatment for PTSD as a breakthrough therapy with the U.S. Food and Drug Administration. But first, I think we have to get over our fear of psychedelics as right now, society is not in a position to really address this issue properly. But if we can get these studies out there, get this information out there, and show people that psychedelics can potentially help them with PTSD, anxiety, and other ailments, then we can use that as a real solution for these issues. You can follow me on Twitter at David Doel, last name spelled Doel, or visit me on YouTube at therationalnational.com. Thanks for listening to The David Doel Show on In Depth Radio, News Talk 1010.